Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to day 2 of Meth Wholesale. Good morning to everybody, good afternoon, and if you're in the US, well done for joining us at 3 or 4 in the morning or whatever it is. I'm Tim Green, I'm the features editor of the Meth, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this next session, which is a spotlight on Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. So just about 100 countries and half the world. Anyway, so for the next hour, we'll be diving into the big issues facing these very important regions, and I have an excellent panel to help me do the job. Kedar from MTN GlobalConnect, Phillip from Modica Group, Miguel from Ooredoo, Moosa from Telenor, Kevin from SMSHIGHWAY, and Mohammed from Vonage, and I'll get them all to introduce themselves in a few moments. But it's a good panel. It's kind of like a rock super group. We've got wholesalers and M&Os and everyone with a bit of expertise from every region. So we just need a drummer and we'll be complete. Anyway, there's loads to cover. So I'll start by asking the guys to introduce themselves very briefly, and I'll start with Kedar.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening for those of you who've joined us from different regions. My name is Kedar Gupta. I am the General Manager for Wholesale Mobility at MTN GlobalConnect. For those of you who are not aware, MTN GlobalConnect is the wholesale arm responsible for all major national, international, and roaming activities at MTN Group. And we operate primarily in the Africa and Middle East region. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, and Phillip.
Thanks, Tim, and hello, everybody. My name is Phillip Linder. I'm a Partner Development Manager with Modica Group. I've had a fairly long involvement with application-to-person messaging going back to 1997 with Apple Newtons plugged into Nokia candy bar phones via an RS-232 connection, and still loving it, still looking forward to what the future has to bring.
23 years in A2P, well done. So Miguel next.
Good morning, my name is Miguel, and I'm responsible for voice roaming and messaging within the Ooredoo Group. So Ooredoo Group has operations in 10 countries covering North Africa, Middle East, and some major Asian countries as well. Look forward to the panel.
Thank you very much. Moosa, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Moosa Abid Babar. I'm heading the messaging team within Telenor Global Wholesale. Telenor Global Wholesale is the international carrier for Telenor Group, managing voice, roaming, connectivity, and messaging. And we have been working on A2P monetization within our European business units and the Asian business units. So for this discussion, I'll be mainly focusing on the Asia business units here.
Excellent. And Graham. Sorry, Kevin. I won't refer to you by your surname for the rest of the session.
No problem. We're not going to be that formal for the next hour. No. My name is Kevin Graham. I'm Chief Development Officer of SMSHIGHWAY Group. We operate in most parts of the world. We have offices in Africa, in Asia, and the Middle East. So yeah, looking forward to the discussion, and thanks everyone for getting involved. Excellent. And finally, Mohammed.
Yeah, good day internet time. I suppose that's the global time of the future where there's no AM or PM. So good day internet time. My name is Mohammed Buhari. I worked for quite a while with an operator in Africa, MTN, and then now part of Vonage, and as career director for Africa. Worked from the technical side of things, development, billing, and now I'm trying to see how we can monetize and get the operators, the regulators, and the markets of Africa really involved in A2P business. Thank you. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, we've got a lot to get through, and please, as ever, all you viewers out there,
get your questions in. Feel free to ask a question at any time. I'll be checking the chat and the Q&A throughout. There's obviously a lot more wisdom out there than there is in my head, so please add your questions to the list, and I'll get to them. So let's start with the obvious one, which is, how are the markets doing in this strangest of years? Now I realise that the panelists have expertise across all regions, but let's start with Africa, and I'll go back to Mohammed, and maybe you can just give us a little overview of what's happened to the market in 2020.
Yeah, I think the market in January to first quarter of the year, we had quite what we call a regular traffic pattern, quite significant volumes. And in the second quarter, when the lockdowns came up across Africa, we had like a very, very massive decline in traffic. But as the operators and the companies across Africa got used to lockdown mode, working away from home, it seems that the traffic really started to climb in Q3, and generally we more than made up for whatever decline or loss we had in Q2. And I think it's the way to go. It's the way of the future, and the operator and the market generally is beginning to accept this concept of lockdown, working from home, and the need to really make value in terms of connectivity and A2P business. Kedar,
what's your perspective on the developments in Africa this calendar year?
It's been a interesting year. It's been harsh. I've said about this yesterday on my panel that obviously the crisis brought about a paradigm shift in traffic patterns and how we as operator groups engineered our networks to accommodate those traffic patterns. I think, because this is a wholesale focused session, we as wholesalers have taken cognizance of retail requirements and then are enabling people to really enjoy working from home, enjoy getting educated from home, enjoy getting entertained at home, and all of this requires a whole lot of work at the background to be able to cater to commodities like voice and SMS and video and data. So that's where the focus area is. And specifically for Africa and Middle East, I think, the whole digital divide while catering to digital acceleration is where the focus is, to be able to create the right kind of fiber ecosystem, the right kind of cable ecosystem to carry that exponential growth in data. So that's my summary statement, Tim.
Okay. All right. Let's go to Miguel, and as you said, you're sort of covering all the regions here, but why don't you start with the Middle East and give us an update on how that's been impacted this year.
So the impact, of course, has been brutal in the beginning of the unknown period. At this point in time, the region is gradually opening up again, so we see a slow pickup gradually, but if indeed there has been a shift into the usage patterns. So from a, let's say, retail perspective, business actually picked up. So we're in line with what we had expected without COVID. Of course, from a wholesale perspective, there has been a huge impact. People stopped traveling or minimal. So that's a shift from the business from a wholesale perspective into more domestic business. So that's, of course, a big change, which will continue for the foreseeable future. Our, let's say, business changed dramatically and we adjusted quickly, but certainly in the messaging space, A2P has continued growing in most of the markets after a short dip.
Interesting that you talked about the lack of travel, because obviously, even though we're all working in a digital field, it's quite an old school business, the wholesale business. It's about individuals meeting other individuals, traveling and shaking hands and so on. So it's kind of an interesting contradiction in that sense. Moosa, can I bring you in at this point? What's your impression of what's happening?
I think yeah, absolutely. I think I have pretty much similar observations like the rest of the participants. I'll just like to add one thing over here is that I think the COVID situation has drastically changed how we interact with our customers. Telenor has been working, and other companies have also been working around digital touch points, omni channels, and so forth. But I think after the COVID situation, it has really, really accelerated. And this has also kind of required the operators to be more kind of digitally operating their networks and their connectivity. And more importantly, when you go digital, it's because you don't have a physical interaction with your customer. Trust becomes one of the very, very important thing over here. So how do you communicate? What kind of packages do you have? How do you accommodate your customers and so forth? Be the enterprises or be the end customer, I think that has become extremely important. When it comes to the A2P market itself, I mean, just focusing on Asia region, we have also seen kind of a increase in traffic, especially kind of in East Asia. We operate in Malaysia and in Thailand, where we've kind of seen a huge increase in traffic after the COVID situation. And I think it's kind of triggered by the fact that people want to connect more and more digitally. And that's why they kind of been using digital apps and other things over here. That has really, really helped us to see growth in this area.
Thanks, Moosa. Phillip, maybe I'll turn to you next. Did you say you're in New Zealand? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, I mean, New Zealand has really, like cut itself off from the rest of the world, certainly at the start of lockdown. So, what's the situation over in Oceania? And also, have you personally been able to do any traveling? And have you had any meetings, or has everything been done digitally?
So we're sort of back to normal with regards to have I been doing any meetings, but we haven't been able to leave the country, of course, because if you do that, coming back is the problem. You then have to go into quarantine for a while. So inside the country, we're sort of business as usual now. We're able to meet and greet, people in person, which is a great thing. From a business point of view, we've seen steady increase in A2P traffic year on year. And the lockdown that we experienced, the pandemic, essentially saw that growth escalate quite wildly. I've got to say, there was a drop off in what you would expect, travel industry and things like that. But there was a huge pickup in other industries. Suddenly, everybody realised that mobile is a great method of BCP, business continuity. You're suddenly able to reach out to everybody ubiquitously, regardless of where they are or what they're running. And we saw a massive uptick in that. There was a little bit of a drop off of that wild growth once the lockdown sort of finished, and everybody sort of took a deep breath and started to realise what normality was. But we're still seeing growth. We're seeing a lot of growth. We're seeing use cases that previously might have been thought about actually being put into action now. There's a lot of acceleration around the pickup of A2P traffic.
Okay. All right. And finally, Graham, I keep calling you Graham, Mr. Graham, Kevin. Maybe you could just give us your impressions finally of the regions that you're active in and what impact COVID has had.
No problem. So, first of all, it's nice to go last after everyone else has said something, because you've all kind of triggered little thoughts in my mind. But I'd probably echo what Phillip's just said in terms of, there's a lot of growth in the A2P space. That's a consistent trend that we've seen over a number of years, and that's continued at similar pace, if I'm honest. I think the way that the traffic is segmented, obviously has followed logical patterns. So retail traffic and marketing traffic linked to retail traffic has dropped. Transactional traffic and the kind of traffic you would expect associated with digital home working has increased, or remote work of any sort. I think it was an interesting comment that Miguel made, because from an operator's perspective, I mean, I'm obviously working in the aggregator space now, but as a good friend and former colleague of Miguel's, you know, we worked together in the past in the operator space, and where the revenues come from in the operator space obviously feed into the capex and the investment that operators make. And if roaming, for example, if inbound and outbound roaming is pretty much, you know, disappeared, from a wholesale perspective, I'd be a little bit concerned about the investment that the operators are making into their networks and the impact that will have medium term on everyone in the industry. But you know, the overall message from us is that we see strong growth. We expect to see that growth continue. I think the other thing I would say is that again, there's logical patterns. So in the Middle East, where you've got a more developed and more mature market, then there's less room to grow into that, if you see it, to grow into the usage patterns in A2P. Whereas in developing markets, the adoption has rapidly developed. So we're certainly seeing pockets of the regions that we're covering this morning grow very quickly from an A2P usage perspective. Okay, so let's go back to Mohammed then. So you know, obviously you're very committed to growing A2P across Africa. Can you tell us which verticals you're seeing the most opportunity in and the most growth in at the moment?
I think across the continent, there's still a kind of development in terms of the pricing of A2P, and this is really reflecting the uptake of the different traffic types. So in markets where pricing are much more, let me say, liberal, then you see, for example, that the promotional messages do tend to grow in such markets. Whereas in markets where, you know, there's a lot of development, transactional messages are for. A bit more services are being brought into transactional kind of models, and so you see that generally is growing definitely because of the lockdown and the impact of COVID. But in terms of the promotional messages, this has really been pushed up, propelled by the pricing models in the different markets. And some of the markets are still working on their segmentation, or even the promotional messages or the transactional messages. You have markets where they're trying to make domestic rates different from international rates, promotional rates different from transactional rates. And then even within the promotional rates, they're trying to do different kinds of strata, you know, having corporate fintech being priced higher than non-fintechs. And of course, then you see the impacts of regulations, where in some countries there's a strict, what I'll call the do not disturb policy, where they try to stop like spam messages going to their subscribers. So in such markets, you see a bit of a hesitation, but generally, the market is adopting what I'll say the common view outside of Africa.
I mean, you've raised so many topics there, you know, pricing, domestic, international, per sector, regulations and so on. We'll come back to all of those, but Kedar, maybe I can come back to you and ask you, you know, which kind of enterprises you're seeing really growing in terms of A2P in Africa, and maybe which ones have been hit hardest by the pandemic.
So look, I think through the pandemic, I mean, you know, when you speak of SMS and when you speak of A2P, I think the transactional volumes have gone up, and, you know, logically so, because people have been sitting at home and doing e-transactions and net banking and things that, you know, you do when you're at home. right? You're not allowed to go outside the house. You're encouraged to stay at home. So obviously there are things that you do digitally, and digital acceleration essentially, like Moosa said, translates to digital transactions, and which translate to we as operators wanting to ensure that those transactions are secure and trustworthy. So when you talk of trust, one mechanism that people employ is two-factor authentication, where a one-time password is sent over SMS. So that traffic has gone up. When it comes to campaigns and promotions from brands, obviously that has gone down because we know the global backdrop. There have been pay cuts. Businesses are trying to ensure that there are cash controls and spend control elements introduced in the ecosystem. And when there is so much of uncertainty, obviously people tend to spend judiciously. So the promotional traffic has kind of not gone up at the same rate that it was going up through the previous years. So that's kind of stagnated, okay? And that's how these two streams are. But coming to pricing that MB raises, right? And again, I am a firm believer that pricing should be assessed basis the resources that are consumed to deliver a particular type of A2P SMS. Now, like Africa, you don't look at it as one market. It's a massive continent. There are multiple markets, each with its own ethnic nuances. Similarly, within the SMS world, there are different kinds of SMSs that would use different technologies, different protocols, different network resources. And one has to price these commodities judiciously to be able to make them affable and likable by the enterprises who want to use this medium.
So how do you differentiate those prices? I mean, what criteria are you using to decide whether who to charge for what?
It's fairly easy if you get into bit byte level technology details. Like if it's a one-time password, it has to be delivered at the time that the transaction is happening. So you have regressive retry schemas. You use your standard Citron technologies to deliver this traffic. And this is the same pipe that would typically take your voice traffic. So because you're putting it on a premium highway, there is obviously a toll that you pay. It's as simple as your normal routine life, right? If you take a highway and you want to reach from point A to point B quickly, there are toll gates and you pay a toll to use that highway. And you could then use, this is like a motorway in the UK, or if you take a state highway where there are, traffic lights and there are stoppages, you don't pay that toll and you kind of take your time to reach. That is what you do on best effort for a campaign or bulk blast, right? You might not use Citron and you might use something like a native IP SMPP element to be able to deliver this traffic on best effort. So those are finer nuances, Tim, that differentiate how you really price your A2P SMS.
Kevin, what do you feel about this? And let's stick with the pricing issue. What do you feel about this segmentation of pricing and how it impacts particular customers of yours? I think you need to come off mute.
I started there by saying I think the first thing to say, what I should have said is the first thing to do is to take myself off mute. Apologies. Yeah, I think it's really important to bear in mind that every operator, every region is different, as Kedar has just said quite eloquently. So some operators are going to have a number of different resources where they can provide different products, different qualities of service that are relevant for certain market sectors. There are others who have a one-size-fits-all because their understanding of how to productize in the A2P space is not sufficiently mature yet. On pricing in general, I do have a concern about pricing at the top and the bottom end. I like to see things in a space that I'm comfortable with, and I'm not so comfortable with some of the pricing I'm seeing in the market that might have implications for us all in the messaging space over a longer period of time, where enterprises might be driven away by prices north of, let's say, 7 cents. Yeah, the other thing obviously is that the separation of local and international pricing, it doesn't help in a territory where one operator does that and another operator doesn't, because you start to get an awful lot of confusion, and that confusion affects the confidence in the market and the confidence in the product. So there's a number of things to consider, and I think you need regional specialists. You need to have people on the ground to understand the enterprise usage patterns, and then that needs to flow all the way through. And you need to have intelligence in our channel, in our part of the market, in our part of the ecosystem. And then the operators obviously need to be either, you know, educated by their partners, or be doing so themselves. And some operators out there, MTN are a good example, obviously have a much more developed understanding of A2P.
Miguel, do you have a developed understanding of A2P?
I'll unmute myself.
Yeah.
I think also because of this segmentation, and we've seen an increase in volume, but also a lot of attempts in the ecosystem to bypass the pricing route. So we've seen a lot of, let's say, gray routes popping up again, which traditionally have been very successful, and very creative mechanisms which we see appear. So our, let's say, teams have been very active in that part as well, in order to make sure that the pricing differentiation for each channel, as Kedar mentioned, are being respected, and no, let's say, bypasses are allowed, which of course is a continued fight for everybody. We will never be able to stop it completely, but that's something that as operators we want to secure and make sure that the customers receive what they require. So one-time passwords, but not all promotional elements should be allowed if it's not in the interest of customers, and certainly not the scamming schemes, the phishing schemes that you see popping up, which is very easy to launch when people are at home, and sometimes a bit bored, and can go into transactions which are not in their best interest. So it's finding the right balance between what you allow and protect your customers to receive, and also, of course, making sure that what they receive is monetized in the right mechanisms without allowing abuse.
Moosa, I could see you nodding your head there. What's your opinion on the pricing, differential pricing for different sectors, for international versus domestic? How are you handling this?
I'd like to add a little bit of additional perspective to this. I think you need to look at it from a customer perspective also. Like Telenor, as I said, we're operating in Europe and also in South Asia and East Asia. What we've seen in Europe is that there's kind of a willingness to pay by the enterprises, right? And be it an international enterprise or domestic enterprise, you kind of see the same kind of willingness there. And that's why we have pretty consistent pricing, be it international or domestic traffic in Europe. In South Asia, for example, in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar, where we operate, the digital kind of ecosystem is developing. It has expedited a lot after COVID-19, but it is a developing market. So that's why when we also started operating, we also had kind of the same principle of having an international price point versus kind of a domestic price point. But I think over time, this will kind of evolve into consistent pricing, because I think that's probably kind of the way to make it consistent across the ecosystem. The second thing I think very important here, which I want to bring up, which we've experienced in Asia, is the regulatory aspect. For example, in the wholesale market, voice is declining. And we've kind of discussed that. You guys discussed this yesterday also. And A2P is really growing, and that's very good. But when something is growing, you have the regulatory looking at, okay, what is happening with this industry? And they kind of come up with, okay, we need to scrutinize this. We need to see on what's happening. And we've actually experienced in some of our markets that the regulatory has gone into how the contractual setups are, how the pricing is, and so forth. And that is a challenge to kind of address, because you will get influenced by the regulatory setting those rules. And the third aspect, after, let's say, seeing all this growth and everything, we've seen a lot of operators. Again, I'm focusing kind of on the South Asia region. doing a lot of RFPs, for example, in order to kind of select exclusive aggregators and or kind of preferred aggregators. Very good concept, but I think the challenge over there is that operators have a responsibility over here not to become greedy, because I mean the short-term win in those kind of RFPs is that okay, I can give you this volume on this price, and the price can be insane. So I think what we need to do is that in these scenarios, you need to make sure that okay, it doesn't go so high that there's no willingness to pay, and the enterprises are then looking for other channels to kind of communicate with the end customer. So I think it's a collective responsibility, and obviously the MNO is the one at the end of the day setting the price, but they need to be, rather than just focusing only on revenue, they need to make this channel as attractive as possible for a long period of time.
Well, there's a lot to unpick there, and you've prompted us to go into different directions. But I'll go back to Phillip, and maybe we can pick up on what Moosa was saying about regulation there. How do you handle the kind of diversity of regulation across? You know, you're working across a lot of countries there. So is that part of your value add, the ability to negotiate and understand those different regulatory environments?
Yeah, look, we take a bit of a stand, to be honest, where we probably take a more strict stance on regulations and base everything on that. So, for example, New Zealand has a very well-regulated A2P industry. We will come together and essentially form a forum basically that says here's how A2P rules will work in New Zealand. They're very robust, and we essentially map those across to other destinations that we deliver and operate in as well. And I think that's a good stance to take, because everybody in our organisation understands those regulations, and it makes it a heck of a lot easier to spot unwanted phishing type traffic, that sort of thing, and it really makes that type of traffic stand out a heck of a lot more versus legitimate traffic. And it also helps us build AI algorithms that we are working on at the moment that help us to analyze traffic and try and highlight problems before they actually get flagged further up the food chain to the MNOs or to the regulatory bodies, so that we can actually get proactive and you know, try and stop the rot, if you will, before it seeps too far in. And I don't think you could do that if there was a lot of disparate regulations that you had to take into account. I think, like pricing, it pays to be consistent in regulation. So, you know, erring on the side of caution, I think, is a good thing for us to do.
Mohammed, I know you brought this up in our preparation for this panel, the question of regulation. So what are your feelings about how you handle that in a market as diverse as Africa?
Is it interesting what Phillip does mention, that the regulations is quite robust in New Zealand. I think across Africa, I think perhaps with the exception of South Africa, most other countries have very little regulations specific to A2P. And so the markets are really being controlled, as it were, by the operators. They form their market, and like industry-driven kind of regulations. But some of the pricing recklessness, maybe, if you want a better word, it's making, in some countries, we've seen the regulators being told to look into some of the activities of some operators and carriers and what have you. And so generally you will see that the operators by themselves are almost like self-regulating at the moment. But I do see that increasingly we will see in countries across Africa a bit more regulations in that sector. Africa is challenged in the sense that there's a big exchange rate variance when we look at our local currencies versus the international currencies, which makes there's a lot of arbitrage, as it were, if you look at the domestic rates, the local rates, and the international rates. So that arbitrage causes a lot of bypass traffic all over the place. And increasingly, with the economic downturn across Africa, I think that the governments and regulators will have to come in some parts of Africa to try and stem the loss, as it were.
Kedar, what about you? What's your view on the regulatory environment across the countries you're active in?
I think Tim MB has hit the nail on its head. I think, look, again, the trend is people are going digital. And to enable a digital economy, there is a lot that has to be done both in Africa and Middle East, okay? Undoubtedly, there is progress. I'm not saying that there is no progress, but regulators and governments need to come together and, make a set of rules which are there to facilitate the use of these mediums such that enterprises can use them and operators can price them basis work done principle, rather than looking at them as revenue shortfall fillers, which is what was asked to me yesterday as well. I think, and I'm aware, Phillip, of the well-contoured rules in New Zealand, where there is a standard set of rules forms that you fill before you even bring on board an aggregator customer. You declare content, you use the right sender IDs. So pricing is just one element of it, Tim. There is a lot of things that regulators and governments need to really do to be able to facilitate use of these mediums for a digital economy. High costs or high prices is one thing, but even infrastructure wise, are we doing enough to enable data connectivity? Are we doing enough to fill up shortage on skills in terms of support that is needed to handle a new customer into digital mediums? Do we have adequate allocation of spectrum to ensure that the internet experience is welcoming and not what we all have gone through 20 years back, where you try to do something and it takes eons to really get to the end result, right? So the economic development is happening, but regulators need to kind of rapidly dovetail into it. Let's put it that way.
What can you do to lobby the regulators to make the right decisions?
So look, as operator groups, obviously, if there is one entity in the whole ICT industry that takes the regulatory brunt, it is the mobile network operator, okay? The rest are all peripheral entities who do not take the brunt of regulatory. I mean, we do engage regulatory in the nicest possible manner and do explain to them the needs of today's communication. And then again, these are fine lines that need to be treaded, okay? There are loads of regulatory bodies that we are talking of here. There is not one single consortia where you go in and make a pitch and get something out. So yes, there is effort from the operator groups to be able to sanitize right from quality of the communication to being able to price it sensibly, okay? Look at it this way. Africa continues to even grow on voice, not just A2P SMS. And to make a cross-border call into Africa, I mean, some countries charge you 30 cents a call, whereas the US, you can make a call for 1/10 of a cent. Or if you go to any European market, you can basically make voice calls for really, really affordable money. When you're going to be spending 30 cents for a call, you're obviously asking for trouble, because you are asking application providers to come in and start to facilitate closed user group communication. So far, our region has been protected because we were on 2G, but the adoption of 4G and 5G is at a rate that is unprecedented, okay? I mean, we've already seen 5G launches in South Africa. Nigeria is already getting onto 5G. MTN has already launched 5G. Now, when you have that kind of internet speed available, you are going to ask your family, friends, colleagues, kin to download the same app that you have and then start to use that for voice telephony. And the only way that, you know, the operator groups can kind of dissuade people from doing that is to price their commodities sensibly. So that's what we are doing. And sometimes we can't do that because regulators have prescribed a floor price or a ceiling price. So then we have to go into the regulator and tell them, you know, can we drop the floor? Or if you think that that's going to impact the total revenues of the government, then can we at least put a cost to these application providers that brings them on a level playing field with operators? So it's a thin line, and it's a balancing act, Tim.
Moosa, are you seeing a similar in your region? You know what Kedar's just said about the you know, prices for cross-border voice and messaging and so on, and are you seeing a similar story play out in Asia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd just like to add one element on the. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'd just like to add one element on the interaction with regulators. I think, yes, we see kind of the price differences, and I think MNOs are kind of setting their own prices in different markets. But I think when it comes to A2P, especially in Asia or South Asia, this is kind of a new, let's say, domain for the regulator. So they're kind of also learning from experience and what's happening over here. I think there's a collective responsibility of the MNOs, aggregators, and other providers to kind of jointly approach regulator over here. Because I think if I'm kind of alone in this war towards regulator, I cannot do anything on my own. I think what we need to have is country by country, maybe to start off with, have let's say MNO forums that can jointly work on how do you monetize A2P. I mean, you cannot obviously have a constant price setup across all MNOs that will kind of go against competition. But I think what you can do is make a common understanding on how monetization will work, what it is international, what is domestic, how do you control fraud, and take that towards regulator and educate them that, okay, this is how we feel and this is our collective view around that. So I think that's probably needed over here. And Telenor, for example, we've kind of tried this in a couple of our countries also. It has, I won't say it has kind of helped us 100%, but it has helped to kind of develop that dialogue with the regulator.
Where did you try that?
We tried that in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. So actually in Pakistan currently we have kind of an MNO forum with all the 4 operators in Pakistan. So we kind of discuss how do you monetize, what kind of so for example 2-3 months back we had a proposal sent out to the regulator that, okay, this is how we feel that you should categorize an international brand and this is how you should categorize a domestic brand. So the regulator had to put that in his directive that, okay, this is how it will work. So it's just one element of it, right? I mean, categorization of brands is one element. There are a few other around that. So, but yet there are challenges also, because then the kind of regulator can go into kind of the commercial aspects of setting the pricing and so forth. So nevertheless, I think the bottom line over here is that a single operator cannot do it alone, or a single aggregator cannot do it alone. This has to be a collective effort across the industry over here.
And did you achieve any results from that activity?
Yeah, so in Pakistan, for example, what we've been able to do is that when we have this kind of definition of, let's say, international and domestic branding, we've kind of taken this out towards the enterprises and the aggregators. What has really helped because in that country we have different pricing for international and domestic, it had helped us to properly look at some of the brands which were domestically monetized, and we had to kind of shift that on the international route. Helped the MNO, increased our revenues. We have kind of a clear regulation on how to monetize, and all the industry players working in Pakistan kind of understood that, okay, this is the definition to follow.
Miguel, have there been any initiatives that you've pursued along these
Yeah,
similar lines to what
we're
was talking
very
about?
active at the moment into the regulators in our countries. And it is an education, and there we've utilized some of the MEF and the GSMA documentation to say this is an industry-wide phenomenon. It's a basic lack of understanding that P2P has decreased and the regulation is still all around P2P. That's reality. In 99% of the cases, the regulator is still 10 years back where P2P was the dominant factor. The regulation has not evolved in the way of A2P market, which is the majority of the traffic at this point in time. OTT has just taken off the P2P channel. So we have to be very quick in adapting, but the regulators don't follow that. So that's where we are doing this in all our markets where needed. But we will never catch up to where the industry is now and will be going. As Kedar said, with 5G, this will be only accelerating. We have a number of markets, certainly in GCC, where we have been live almost 3 years. But of course, the interoperability is not there yet. It's not standalone networks yet. So that's the next step. When it will be standalone, you will be able to interact with other operators as well. So that's where this regulator space is critical, because they sometimes destroy the industry without thinking about the construct of what a regulation on national level has an impact in downstream in the A2P space. So that's where we're educating. And there, of course, MEF, GSMA, all bodies which are able to give a global view or even regional view certainly helps, because that gives credibility that it's not only an individual operator. So that's where we have to be even stronger in educating the ecosystem, including regulators and governments.
Kevin, do you think Miguel's right? Do you think a lot of regulatory regimes are looking at P2P rather than A2P?
Kevin thinks that I'm always right.
whatever you tell him to think, he thinks it.
We agree on most things apart from football, Miguel. But look, Tim, this is. I'm gonna take it one step further. I agree with everything Miguel's just said, but I actually probably would have said back when Kedar mentioned this that I don't think the regulators are the right people to get involved with some of the more progressive technologies and even A2P right now. You've got to bear in mind that this industry changes very, very quickly. It's still a very young industry in some respects. So, as you say, regulators are used to voice or terms like wireline and landline. They haven't moved on, and I struggle to keep up, and I work at the coalface every single day. So if you look at what the sender ID registry work that's being done in the UK as an example, I know it's not in the particular geography we're focusing on here, but it's a good example where the MEF has been has played a key role in bringing industry specialists together. That is where I think regulation needs to come for us to control and to use the knowledge that we all pick up on a daily basis, keep it relevant, keep addressing it, accept that we'll never get everything right, we'll never get fraud complete, we'll never deal with 100% of the fraudulent actors in the industry, we'll never monetize everything, we'll never standardize everything, but we're the best people to do it, in my opinion, and that's the ecosystem that we have right here on this call. I don't believe that introducing a regulator and a regulator's mentality into that process is going to help anyone.
Mohammed, what do you think? Are you involved in any kind of activity to talk to regulators in your markets and improve their understanding of what's possible with A2P and so on?
I think it all comes from the market environment, you know. So like we learn from economics, if you have a perfect competitive environment, then, you know, things tend to be efficient and well priced. And where you have a market that is not very competitive, then you have operators that tend to take advantage, undue advantage of their monopoly or whatever advantage that they have. So what we've been conversing for and working with operators, generally most of the markets, is to self-regulate. You know, let the operators do things that are reasonable and never bring in the regulator into the space. You know, self-regulate, you know, evolve, do what is right for your customers, your citizens. And never, the regulators will not have any reason to come in. But if you continue on the path of doing things that are really, really unwholesome, then you are likely to bring in the regulator into your space. So if we look at, for example, the domestic enterprises versus international enterprise, a domestic enterprise, let's say logistics company, may be able to afford 1 cent for A2P. Maybe an international can afford 5 cents. But if you decide to price everybody at 5 cents, then the domestic logistical company is likely to cry wolf. And in their crying wolf, then the regulator, you know, is brought to that regulator's attention, and they have to come and interfere. So it's better for you to self-regulate, do something that makes sure that the prices are affordable, make the prices transparent, and make it create value, like Kedar mentioned sometimes, you know, make a clear segmentation of your prices, and then the regulators will have no reason to come in.
Okay. So, Phillip, I'm going to come back to you now. So Kedar was talking about the sort of speed with which some of the markets that he works in are adopting 4G and 5G and so on. So obviously that introduces the prospect of OTTs and RCS and new forms of more advanced forms of messaging. You're probably in a more mature market than perhaps some of the others in this panel. So are we starting to see any adoption of RCS and OTT by the enterprises that you're working with?
Well, actually, believe it or not, we're not mature when it comes to RCS in this part of the world. We're actually a victim of the tyranny of geography because we're so far away. Our carriers have got small subscriber base that they're not the first to you know, put their hands in their pockets and pay for what's required to get RCS or RBM, which is the part that we're interested in, up and running. There is certainly a huge appetite, though, for more intelligent messaging. SMS A2P is always going to be there for, you know, for fit for purpose, OTP type stuff, that sort of thing. But there is definitely an appetite, especially now with the pandemic being the great accelerator that we're seeing. There's a great appetite there for people to be able to do a lot more with, you know, the simple message, and to add to that to be able to do that ubiquitously. So, you know, with scant regard to what application or platform your end user's on, you know, the sort of the holy grail is to be able to just do almost everything you can now with that simple message to get that interactivity going with the end user. Great appetite, but I don't have any great stories to tell you about it just yet because we're still waiting for adoption here by the MNOs.
Miguel, are you seeing any enterprises looking beyond SMS to other forms of other ways of authenticating or promoting to their customers?
Of course, they're looking at an omni-channel approach. So we've seen some of our markets where we have been able to control all low-cost routes quite efficiently. And there we see the omni-channel approach, not only because of a price perspective, but also because of an approach that people are utilizing multiple communication means. Some might OTT driven, some might be enterprise driven. So we've seen evolution as well, where enterprises are taking more control in-app communication. So that's certainly something that the ecosystem is evolving. But the good thing about SMS, it's going to be there for a long time, and the number of use cases are increasing, and the backup is always SMS. So that's always going to be the driver. It's at this point in time still growing. At one point in time, we have to be realistic that the volumes will start to decrease, but when that will be, personally, when I started with an SMS, I thought it's never going to be. If you look toward the volumes we do now from an enterprise perspective, it's huge. And use cases keep increasing in this digital shift that's happening. So that's certainly something that will continue, and SMS will be part of that. And omnichannel will diversify even further. And we have to manage that, we enable that, and make sure that we capture all those channels in order to keep the communication to our customers alive, and make sure that enterprises do this in a easy way. That's what we've achieved with the A2P ecosystem, that it functions. It's not perfect, and that's where we have to keep on evolving into other channels as well.
Could you quantify some of this? How many A2P messages is your group sending in a year, for example?
I'm not allowed to communicate on exact volumes, of course. That's.
What about? Could you give us a percentage that you think it might grow by?
15% growth year on year, depending on markets. But overall, some markets are already very mature. Some markets are not there yet. So some are higher, some are very low digits. But on average, I would say 15-20% growth is the trend. Of course, there has been an anomaly this year, but overall, I think that's the correct figure.
What's the anomaly this year?
COVID.
No, but so I mean, what's the number?
So we saw a drop of 20%, very spot on during that critical down period in some markets, but that's quickly disappeared when people adjust to it. But you saw a drop and then an increase to the normal growth level.
What about UK though? What sort of, could you put any numbers on growth and how COVID's affected it this year?
Look, I think from a growth perspective, I think, SMS business has grown, and during COVID also, even when the initial phase, uncertainty phase, we saw a whole lot of messages that were sensitizing people of the impact of COVID. So traffic never kind of went down in this entire pandemic or crisis time. Okay, traffic has stayed in line with how the growth trajectory was thought of. In terms of A2P messages, I think on a monthly basis across the group, leaving our properties of Iran and Syria, we do about 200 million A2P messages a month, and we feel that we still have a chance to grow this pie if we take it to the right segments and make it affordable to the right enterprises. Now, to a point that was discussed around international enterprise and domestic enterprise. Look, I think there is no signaling out international enterprises. Okay, the mere difference here is domestic enterprises located domestically hand over traffic to us at domestic points of interconnect. What we do elevate for enterprises who are not local to a country and not local to 20 countries is, rather than doing the effort of signing 20 contracts, making 20 different interconnects, putting 20 different account teams. And that's what the customer pool should also start to appreciate, that operators are bringing to you a single connection, a single platform, taking the onus of obligations in 20 different markets on themselves, and still letting your communication reach the end user in the best possible manner. That's the reason why there is a slight premium on brands who want to make that advantage, and take advantage of that facility. So you connect to me in one location, let's say London, and then from there on, I go to all the different 20, 25 markets that we operate in without you having to go sign contracts and make interconnections, manage those, put account teams, have settlement agents. All that is, parked in the bin then. That's the difference between domestic and enterprise in terms of pricing for me.
Well, we've had a few questions come in, and I've sort of covered them off with some of my questioning, but we had a question from Jose, which is what needs to happen to ensure that operators focus on improving SMS service and not just on high price monetization. So Moosa, maybe you can handle that one. I suppose it's a question really about quality as opposed to merely, price and quantity.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a very good question. My view is that we're kind of at a tipping point right now in this industry, and I think this COVID has really accelerated the digital adaptation of end customer. We've kind of seen a lot of different markets developing, especially in South Asia and East Asia, like food companies and digital banking and financial services and so forth and so forth. I think, as I said earlier in the conversation also, it's extremely important that we have a very good infrastructure. We have connectivity with enterprises and with the aggregators. Our MNOs have deployed firewalls in order to protect the network, protect fraud and spam. Now it's important that we retain this. And the only way we retain this is that we keep this channel as attractive as possible. There was one of the participants mentioning that SMS will remain, and even if it goes to other channels, it will always be a backup. I don't want to see SMS as backup. I want this to be seen as a prime channel for the customers to use. And I think for that, it's very important. Price we've kind of talked about, but it's also very important that you kind of introducing new use cases over here more rapidly, more quickly, and monetize that for your customers. So simple things that, for example, what we are doing in some of our markets on kind of the traditional SMS is not only just focusing on A2P messaging, but also introducing P2A in some of the markets, so that kind of the interaction becomes more conversational between end customer and the enterprise. We're also looking into and have introduced different pricing based on content, be it transactional messages, promotional, and so forth. So I think you need to innovate with these so that you keep the channel as attractive as possible. And then, yes, when the evolution of RCS comes in, you kind of have a good basis to work on eventually then.
Well, Moosa's talked about P2A there. That's a whole other topic. Maybe we can just briefly touch on that, though. So, Kevin, are you seeing any evidence of a kind of P2A revolution in the markets you're active in?
Yeah, very much. I mean, the operators we work with, I think their interest has been piqued slightly because the perception is that it's an additional revenue stream. I'm not sure it's quite the additional revenue stream that they thought it was, because it's probably incorporated into what many businesses are doing at the moment. But what I would say is that I don't see the technical capability within most of the operators to be able to facilitate it, to productize it at the moment. So again, we come back to the education piece and the investment to separate and to differentiate as an operator that provides a rich suite of messaging services.
Miguel, are you starting to productize P2A in any way?
Absolutely. It's something that we're trying in some markets. It's not all across all our opcos, of course, yet, but certainly in the more advanced markets is something that we're putting in place. And also on the quality side, I think this is something that we closely monitor, sure that the latency is kept to a minimum, delivery rates kept high. So that's, of course, the premium that Kedar was mentioning, that we make sure that we keep the delivery and the reliability of the service as high as possible. So that's something which is being more and more focused on in order to keep it as a premium service and reliable and justifying a little bit higher price, making sure that the response rates. Don't forget, this is benchmarking against other channels where, of course, the response rate in SMS is still the highest. So that's where I fully agree with Moosa that it's not only a backup, but because of the high response rate, certainly in the P2A, it will become even more valuable.
Phillip, what's your view on this question of service quality, SMS quality? I mean, you mentioned using AI and machine learning and so on earlier on. Can you use technology to help you to deliver a better service on SMS?
I'm not sure that we could use it with regards to the actual delivery, but just on that, I would just point out that, of course, the mobile network operator is beholden on themselves to make sure that the service is reliable and is quality, because if they're not delivering, they're not earning. So, it's a key part of that equation. But I don't think the AI that we're talking about will do much for the delivery. It's more around getting intelligence from the actual message and trying to be more proactive on unregulated messages, more proactive for customers too, so that we're able to highlight to the enterprise if there's certain spikes in sentiments, for example. I mean, as a bank, if you're sending out OTP messages, you may want to know that one particular person's getting 50 of those in a day, for example. That might be indicative of a fraud problem, for example. So there's a lot of value that we're achieving from the intelligence around the actual content of the message, not necessarily delving into the content, but you know, the anonymized content of the message, the sentiment of the message, and that's more where we're going with that. Just coming back to your P2A though, we've seen a great uptick in mobile originate messages to start the process. For example, you know, you go to a supermarket during the whole lockdown period to do your shopping, you can send a text to tell the supermarket that you are sitting in the car park waiting to get in, and of course their application will then just slot you into the queuing system and send you out a text to say, you know, your number's up, you're ready to go into the supermarket. So we're seeing a lot of use cases like that that are getting more and more prevalent.
Has anyone in the panel, it's an interesting use case, has anyone else got a use case that they've seen that's they didn't expect this year and they're seeing growth in? Anyone want to raise their hand?
But we've seen a lot of utilization for health use cases, which previously we of course never saw. So that's an obvious one, I think, in every market. A lot of the public entities started utilizing this to communicate appointments for tests, communicating confinement. So this is a huge use case, which we only are at the starting point now, because this is here to last. The control will remain very strict. So that's something that we certainly see, but that's more on a domestic level. But of course, the ecosystem and the enterprises will continue finding this, and that's certainly the health vertical as such we see as a strong driver going forward.
Well, who knows what kind of new use cases we'll see as a result of the weird world that we're living in, and what will stick and what will go away. And it's been a fascinating hour talking to you guys, trying to cover a massive region, a diverse region. It's been a tricky job for a moderator, I can tell you that. But once again, I thank you all for your time. Phillip, Kedar, Miguel, Mohammed, Kevin, and Moosa, thank you very much for your time. For a few of the viewers out there, please enjoy, stay tuned for the rest of the day and for more sessions. The next one coming up is a forecast of A to P global market with Nick Lane from Mobile Squared. So stay tuned for that, and enjoy the rest of the day, and we'll see you soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, team.
Bye.
Well done.
Thanks.